Thank you for doing that.
Sure.
So tell me, why did you want to talk today?
Because you reached out to me, and because you're looking for action from the city government, and I want to talk to you about how we take constructive steps forward.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything in my letter that stuck out to you particularly?
I just recognize the frustration of, you responded particularly unhappy that I said I was the mayor of the whole city, and very distressed by what that implied. And so I think what I intended was not what you took away from it. What I intended to say was, I'm accountable to an entire city in terms of a process. As we change policies and discuss policies, I'm accountable for how that moves forward. Mm-hmm. And the city, where the city council is governed by operating agreements, we're governed by ordinance, we're governed by state statute in some cases, and I'm accountable for that.
So I guess one of my main questions to start with is, you've now openly proclaimed your support of Black Lives Matter. So what does true solidarity mean on that front to you?
I think good faith action.
Can you be more specific?
We're in a process. I think we will function at multiple levels on this. So it's one of the things that I want to hear from you, and I want to hear from other protesters and organizers. We've already begun the process in council at looking at creating a task force, which was Councilor Evans and Councilor Ye have both requested that. So we're in the process, and council will have a public meeting about that process. We have a scheduled meeting on the 20th to talk about our community safety initiative and other investments in police and the extent to which how we want to respond to demands for shifting those expenses, how we want to review that. So there's this sort of immediate, what's on council's agenda? How does council begin to review existing policies, review the budget as requested, review our priorities? So there's that structural work, and that work begins, and I'm accountable for that. That is the right work, it's appropriate work, and we're beginning that work. I think broader level, there was the question of the structural racism, the ways in which we create barriers for people of color to access housing, to access education, to access jobs, to benefit fully from our community and be fully recognized in our community. And that's deeper, broader work, and that's where I am really looking to you and others for how do we take that step from protest demands to engagement and solutions? What do those steps look like to you that would feel constructive, forward-moving, and tangible enough that we make that progress? And so I hold myself accountable to doing that work.
So I guess one of my first questions is, have you met with any of the protest groups?
I haven't met with the groups as a whole. So I have been doing just a little bit of this work, and actually just last night, talking to some of my advisors and others, and talking to people in the Human Rights Commission, talking about sort of creating a list so I can do that in a disciplined way, put together a list of the people I need to reach out to and begin to do that. I have been doing it in a much more you wrote to me a couple of times and I responded to you. That's happened with a couple of other people who wrote to me a couple of times and I responded. And I actually need to sort of wrap my arms around it in a more organized way. So that is the next step for me.
So just so I'm sure of what you're saying, you have not spoken to any of these groups in an official way?
I have met them because I've gone to events, but it's time for me to have this very direct conversation about what people want and what are those steps together that we can take? How do I be the most responsive to those demands?
And which events have you been to?
So I went to the first big rally protest march from the courthouse to Alton Baker Park. And so I met Madeline Spencer there and others. And then I went to both of the Juneteenth events and so talked to a couple of folks at each of those events. So, but this is not in an organized way. It was a way of just walking up and saying, I just want you to know I came and appreciate your work. So I really, I need to take those next steps.
I mean, honestly, like, that is probably one of the biggest things you could do, because you and I can talk about policy change forever, but I'm not a person of color, and these people are doing the research. They're looking at what other cities are doing. So it seems like that should be a very urgent thing on your list.
It is. And it is. It's a very urgent thing on my list. So I'm just getting organized around that, getting that list of contacts and how to reach out to them, and so that I can do that in a systematic way, reach out to the people I need to talk to.
So you were talking about like how to get people involved to kind of fix this and engage with this issue. So I've been watching city council meetings for years now, and I watched the night, was it last week, when everybody called in to ask to defund or reallocate funds from the police. And the outcome was not what I wanted or what a lot of other people wanted. And so my question is twofold. First, something I've noticed that to me it seems like it is not actions taken by the council and you, the mayor, and the city, that shows me that I don't think you are interested, is people have been pouring their heart out about real struggles in their life at these meetings, and they get 2 to 3 minutes, and a lot of times the council doesn't respond at all. There's no interaction. You guys aren't held accountable. You're not forced to address any issues. And I've seen so many people take time out of their day to come speak to council, and then they prepare something and pour their heart out to you about something that's really affecting their life. And, I've just seen the blank stares of the counselors. And then even when counselors and you, the mayor, have a chance to speak at the end, often you don't address what people said. And I understand that there's even been changes to the public comment that actually discourages participation even more. And I'm wondering why that is.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I'll go back to your last point first, which it is true that we have for a long time in the public forum, the structure has been first come, first serve, and people get 3 minutes. Unless we have so many people wanting to testify, then as the mayor, I have the option of reducing the amount of time so that people don't have to wait quite so long. If everyone gets 3 minutes and we have 60 people, it's a long wait for someone to get up to speak. So that's how it has functioned until recently. And we have very robust public forums on a lot of issues. And so we put in a lot of hours to hear people. And there was a feeling that the first come, first serve wasn't always fair, because some people are racing to get from work or other things, taking care of their kids before they come down. And it felt that wasn't entirely fair, that they always had to wait to the end of the line if they couldn't get there early. So we shifted it. And in order to be consistent and predictable, we said it will always be 2 minutes instead of 3 minutes. So people will prepare for 2 minutes as opposed to preparing for 3 minutes and then hearing from me at the last minute that I'm cutting it short, and then they can't give their whole planned presentation. So it felt fairer, since we're so often cutting back to just say, okay, just prepare for a 2-minute presentation so you won't be frustrated that you get cut off. And we set it up that it would be instead of first come, first serve, that we would randomize it. So people would sign up and then we would randomize it so that you would have as good a chance as anyone else of getting sort of earlier into the night. So that's what we set up just in the beginning of 2020. And then COVID hit and we were having a virtual meeting. So then we're back. We're still holding to the 2-minute time frame, but we're back on a kind of a first come, first serve basis because there's no other way of managing the queue. So that's how that works, and that's why.
Just one comment on that.
Yeah.
I know that for a lot of people that is been super detrimental because 2 to 3 minutes is not an effective time to get a point across in any real meaningful way. So a lot of times people, for example, if they had a prepared statement from a group or a professor or something, would read that statement in parts, and now that eliminates that option.
Yeah, I know. It's not, none of these are perfect systems. I hear that. And so we did this as an experiment. If this structure, and now it's kind of thrown off by COVID, but when we're back having in-person meetings, we may reconsider it. So the council wanted to try a change and see if it made a difference. If it's not working for people, we won't stay with it. So that's always open to comment. The other piece is that there are other ways to communicate more deeply and fully with counselors and with me. And so when you have, we set up meetings. We meet with constituents. We meet with members of the public to talk about issues that are on your mind. And so that you should always consider that an option because it is frustrating to have 2 or 3 minutes to talk about something which is much more complex and nuanced and has a lot of pieces to it. So So I'm with you on all of that. It's very challenging. And I think, recognizing that council, when I first took office in 2016, I had this idea that it was hard for the public to track all of the different work that council was doing. And so I proposed creating a dashboard.
Mm-hmm. I remember that.
And it turned out we ended up really being a spreadsheet. And so we did create it and we managed it. And the idea was that you could go to that spreadsheet and it would give you information about when the council had last discussed an item, what the status of it was, who the key staff contact person was, and some insight about when it would be coming back to council. So if you were just trying to follow one thing, you could just click on it, find it, get the information you needed. And, when we first set that up, council, there were 40 different issues that council is tracking at any given time and rotating through on council work sessions. That list is much longer now because those issues don't go away. Climate change and our action on climate change doesn't go away. It comes back in different forms over time. So, part of our challenge is just a time management thing. This is a volunteer council. Half of the council have full-time jobs. They are responsible for council meetings. They're also all sitting on different boards and commissions, so they have multiple obligations. And it takes a lot of preparation to actually just do your homework for a council meeting because there are all these topics. So we're always juggling time and capacity. And, so you're experiencing that as members of the public as well.
So what do you think of when, for example, we watch these council meetings and it doesn't even look like people are paying attention. I mean, I think Eddie Taylor fell asleep. I think that, Mike Clark turned his camera off for a while. And then to see something like the majority of people calling in to say we need to either defund, reallocate, or abolish the police, and then nothing in the council and the mayor's actions reflect that.
Right, it's frustrating. I get that. And it was the reason that at the beginning of that council meeting, both the city manager and I laid out what the process was going to have to be on the budget, because we have requirements around public hearing. And if we make, the cutoff is very small on last minute adjustments to the budget. They have to be in the sort of $5,000 range. So it's not legally possible with a week to go for council to make a major change in a budget because it has to go back out to public hearing, and there has to be a certain amount of time of notice of a public hearing so the public can comment, and 8 days just doesn't embrace that much time. So I explained that at the beginning of the meeting, and the city manager explained that at the beginning of the meeting, so that people would know we were going to listen to you, but that was not a night in which we were constrained by the time frame that we could not do it. And that is why we also were clear that we have a supplemental budget process, and that's where council will look at adjustments to the budget. And that is where this July 20th meeting about the community safety initiative, that's where that comes into play. And that will be a public process. And that will be a process that, again, people can testify, they can watch that process and participate. And if there are changes in the budget, we'll have hearings on it. So
okay, so I have a couple things to say to that. It seems that I understand what you're saying about due process and everything, but I think a lot of people would argue that the payroll tax that was passed a year ago did not seem as concerned with the constituents and due process. And in fact, the city has said that they expect this to be overturned. And in fact, that was to raise the police budget.
right. Well, we did go through exactly the same process with the community safety initiative. It went through a public hearing, went through a comment period. It went through all of those things. So it did take a long time to pass that. Actually, didn't happen overnight. There were a lot of
I thought that any payroll tax was supposed to be go to the council can't just decide that unilaterally.
No, the council has legal authority to pass its own funding measures. They can go to the public, but they're not legally required to always go to the public.
Okay, so what do you think of that now? This regressive payroll tax, which affects people who don't make a lot of money the most, and then it's my understanding that most of that goes to the police.
Yes. So we went through sort of a 3-year process. It really began after Chief Kearns left as police chief, and we had Detective James came in as our kind of interim acting chief before we hired Chief Skinner. Director James really kind of started this sort of assessment and audit of our police force, because we actually, I know it doesn't feel or sound that way to you, but we actually have an underfunded police department in terms of it's understaffed, it's under capacity. And the data, and I cited this at Tuesday night when people were on my driveway, that the police are not responding to 30% of the calls for service. So these are people who are asking for service, and the police are not responding because they just don't have the capacity. It's hard to get across town. They don't have enough staff. There are lots of pieces there. So we did do a pretty robust assessment of our police department. And the key piece really was staffing, was that we were short on staff to meet the needs of the community. I'm just giving you the background, and I'm going to take this forward. We did that assessment. There was a lot of outreach to the community and discussion about it. Council agreed that investment should be made. We formed a separate revenue committee that had counselors as well as members of the community sitting on that revenue committee to look at the different ways in which we could increase our funding for our police budget. And the determination was that a payroll tax was going to be the most effective way of doing it. And so the concept behind that payroll tax is that it was very broad and very shallow, that many people would pay into it, but no one would pay very much. And we exempted minimum wage workers, and we lowered the rate for workers that were just above minimum wage at $12 to $15 an hour. How that works now is open to question, because we obviously projected this at a time when the economy was strong. We're now facing a recession. So there are multiple ways in which we might look at that initiative again. But that was the concept behind it, is that we needed policing, and that the more people who pay into it, the smaller amount they have to pay. And for everybody, it's less than, I don't have these numbers right in front of me, but I have to look at the numbers again to get it right. I don't want to misspeak here.
Honestly, just because I know we don't have that much time, I'm not as interested in the fine print of that rule. I guess the point that I'm getting to is you're telling me that the EPD is underfunded or 30% understaffed. However, I think people would argue that we're understaffed, but we have military gear.
Yes, so I think that this is certainly an important conversation about what kind of equipment does the police purchase and how are they using it. And I think we're definitely seeing that now, that reevaluating that. It's not the big part of the big part of the budget is personnel. The big part of the community safety initiative is all personnel. It's not about equipment at all.
Okay, but we're talking about the military, the tools of war that
yes, I agree.
Yep. Have in their toolkit, and I think people want to know where you stand on this being used on your citizens.
Yeah, I'm not happy about it, and I think it was definitely overused and badly used. So I'm not happy about it, and that is undergoing review. We have both a police auditor that's looking at hundreds of hours of videotape, and he will weigh in. A civilian review board will look at that, and the police commission is going to look at that as a policy. And the chief has already stepped out and said, we're looking at that. So absolutely, we are not happy about it.
What do you think have you stated that publicly, that you would like the demilitarization of the police?
I'm looking for, I would like to have a police department that does the best, safest work possible. And I do not believe that, firing excessive amounts of tear gas, is really the appropriate response. So yes, we're all looking at that. And I will expect that in fairly short order, there are going to be changes to policies. I mean, the police chief was out yesterday. It's in the newspaper today, talking about looking at our crowd control policies. How do we look at that? What are those protocols? What equipment do we use? That's all coming. That's all coming.
Do you condone the use of rubber bullets?
I don't. But I'm also, I'm a civilian. I've never been a police officer. I've never been in a front line of, I don't have any training in this. So I don't know what the training is, what the protocols is, so that's why I am.
I don't know either, but it's very clear to me that the use of rubber bullets on is inappropriate.
Yeah, I'm with you.
I don't think it makes
under what circumstances. I don't know under what circumstances one might make an argument that it's justifiable. I just don't know that. So I'm not weighing in on that until I get a more full report.
But is it justifiable on peaceful protesters?
I think on peaceful protesters, we don't want to be firing things at peaceful protesters. I think the challenge, so no, we don't want to be firing weapons at peaceful protesters. Absolutely not, of any sort.
Because you understand that like some reporters in town were even targeted.
I understand that. And I will be very interested to see the police auditor's report.
So I think a concern is that even the police auditor hasn't, first of all, he seems very chummy with the police, and he doesn't have a lot of teeth in what he's doing, and he lacks a sense of urgency, which I think belies a larger issue, is that you're asking me what the city can do. I think there's a huge erosion in trust with city officials, especially among people my age and younger. I'm in my late 30s, and I've been watching how the city operates for years, and I've been seeing when I talk to people in the community, people shake their head about city officials and they feel like nobody's listening. And they don't understand the urgency, and they are working for a certain part of Eugene and not the most vulnerable. And as I think you've probably heard the axiom about, you judge a country about how it treats its most vulnerable. And, I'm seeing headlines of homeless camps getting cleared out yesterday, which is another conversation I would love to have with you, but that is not what we're here to talk about today. But on my point of the frustration that exists and that is growing is that the city lacks urgency and isn't really listening. And I will give an example of this. When the protesters came to speak to you at your house, I wasn't there, but I watched the video and also talked to a lot of people afterwards. And the concept of police abolition came up, and you did not know what that meant. And I need to know how at this point you could not, to me, I don't understand an acceptable response to that, because either you're out of touch and you're not paying attention, because this is something that people have been talking about, especially in the past couple months, but like for years, or you're being willfully ignorant about it. And I don't understand how you as a mayor could not understand what people are talking about in that moment.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I think that's a fair accusation to wage at me. And I actually sat through a surge presentation on Friday that was about police abolition. I assumed when people asked me that question that there were specific aspects or specific principles that they were referring to in police abolition. And because I didn't know that much about it, I wasn't prepared to make a full statement. So you're right. I have some homework to do. I've started doing that homework. And it's what I said to the crowd was educate me.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't know about this, educate me. And actually someone did follow up. She sent me many, many links. I think she sent me 21 emails with different links. So, I have some homework to do, but I'm actually interested. I'm very interested in the issue. So, but yes, it's.
But I think what people are concerned about is the lack of urgency on your part and curiosity about this historic movement that you wouldn't already have. I mean, what was that, a week ago? And George Floyd passed, a month and a half ago now? And that has been the entire discussion. Why
That's
were
true.
you doing
That's true.
homework before, and why weren't you curious?
That's true. Well, I've talked about it in terms of police reform. I've talked about it, I've talked about the police defunding. I haven't used the term police abolition, and I wanted to be clear about what that term actually implied in terms of where we're going. So yes, I'm looking at it in a more nuanced way, wanting to understand specifically when people say police abolition, what are they saying as opposed to saying defunding the police? Is it the same thing? Is it a different thing? I just wanted to be really clear about what people mean when they say those things. And even with police defunding, people talk about it in different ways. There are different interpretations of what they're really after. So I am doing my homework. I have been doing my homework on that. I talked about the city having been engaged in an assessment of our police department and part of developing the community safety initiative, understanding what 21st century policing really means. So it's an issue that I have been tracking, not exactly using the language that you are using.
Okay. I encourage you to learn a lot more about it because people are going to keep asking you.
Fair enough. Absolutely. That's my intention.
Where was I going to go from here? Abolition. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. 1 second. Oh, okay. So talking about what the city is able to do and what a realistic timeline is, we have seen cities around the country now, city councils and mayors around the country commit to either dismantling the police force or defunding it in the same time that our city has had. Why are other cities able to do it and we are not? Especially when we have a nationally recognized model for an alternative in our city, which, by the way, is having to have a fundraiser tonight because they aren't getting the funds they need.
Right.
So what makes Eugene special that it can't do this?
Well, it's not that we're special, and it's not that we're ignoring that. We have a different structure, city structure. So, if you look at the city of Portland, the mayor is also the police commissioner in Portland, and he's also a strong mayor system. So there are things that he can do that I am not empowered to do as a mayor. So we have a different structure. We, as I mentioned on Tuesday night to the protesters and have said many times, we have 6 city departments: police, fire, public works, library and recreation library, recreation and cultural services, planning and economic development, and then our central service, our administrative arm. So you will hear in that there is no housing department, there is no health department, there's no direct way in which the city can take funds from the police department and put that equivalent amount of funds directly into another program. Our relationship with Cahoots is through Whitebird, which is a freestanding nonprofit. So that's a contractual agreement. That's not an automatic, that we don't, that those funds just don't automatically go there. There's a contract with it. So that's different from, say, the city of Portland, where they have a health department, they have a housing department. I mean, it's part of the same structure, city structure.
Yeah, I understand. I'm well versed in the structures of all these cities, but I've seen the city do extraordinary things and take extraordinary measures in cases of urgency. And for some reason, this does not seem to be an urgent matter for the city.
Well, I think that there are emergency operations and then there are long-term sustained programs. So during COVID, we mobilized some emergency systems, particularly around the homeless. We can't sustain those because we haven't designated the funding stream that would pay for it. So we're
do you see that now? Wait. Do you see the cognitive dissonance there that you can't, you couldn't keep doing that, but you can raise money for the police. And when you look at what the majority of calls that police are responding to, it's to homeless people.
So this is absolutely it is a cognitive dissonance, and it is the challenge that is before us. So we are, as you know, we've also done a huge amount of work on how do we improve our delivery of services to the homeless, and we have worked closely with the county on that. We developed this.
But why are camps still being?
Let me just finish. So we have done a huge amount of work on that, and the iterative step and the step that council just talked about a month ago is how are we going to pay for it? So we're in the same place we were on our community safety, where we said, all right, we need to create a revenue committee to figure out how do we pay for these services that we're not delivering. That is also true in our housing and homelessness service. How do we pay on a sustained level for more robust services? Because right now we don't actually have that revenue stream. So that is the issue we have homeless people camping all over our community because there is no place for them to go. We have no place for them to go. And we need sites, and we need to be able to provide the services that they need. And it is a humanitarian crisis that we absolutely have to address, and would love to take it off the backs of the police, which is totally inappropriate and triggering to everyone's trauma that the police are the...
But then why couldn't the city pass a payroll tax and use that money for the homeless?
So that we could do that. So we could consider some other option. Either it's a payroll tax.
But if you can do that for the police, and you're paying the police to address issues of transients and homelessness, why not just use that money to help the homeless?
Right. Yeah, and so that could be a direction. So
why not?
Well, I can't. So I just had this conversation with several people about looking at the use of police officers. What percentage of their time? What is the cost to the community in terms of how the time they are spending responding to people who are homeless? What is that chunk of time? And is there a way of reapportioning how that time is spent? So police officers get to do what police officers should be doing, and we have a more appropriate response through outreach teams and through our service providers to people who are homeless. So that is, I think that is exactly the question that is before us now. How do we do that?
But I think that people will feel very unsatisfied knowing that a payroll tax that was unpopular could be passed to pay for more police services while the homeless are being moved from site to site. And that money is going to police to do that. You've got to understand how backwards.
I get that. And that is exactly why I just said what I just said, which is we have the data for that. We have the data about how police are spending their time. So does that mean that we look at a different kind of configuration, both within the Community Safety Initiative and in terms of how we are funding the services for the homeless? So that the beginning part of that conversation is council's work session on July 20th. That's the beginning of that conversation. So yes, those are the questions that we need to ask.
Okay, so
but I just want to repeat this, that I recognize that there is this enormous groundswell of frustration with police and with investment in police and with what that says about us as a community, what that says about us as a nation. I am with you. I have spent my whole life thinking, why even as a nation do we spend all this money on military and we don't spend money on health or education or housing? I mean, as a nation, we have this disconnect, and that is, looking at our budget, go right. The city is responsible for police and fire, but the city actually doesn't have a budget. I mean, a significant budget related to housing. We do spend money on housing and we spend money on homelessness, but not at that same level because it's always been a county role. So those are the sort of essential questions about how we look at, as a nation, how we look at where we're spending our money. How are we using taxpayer dollars? Is that appropriate? I'm completely on board with that reevaluation. And I think,
I think MayorVinis,
But I did want to say one other thing. But the other piece of this is that we did do a thoughtful evaluation of what our police were capable of doing within their current staffing structure. And we do have broad segments of this community that are frustrated because the police don't show up. And so we started from that premise, which is, as outraged as you all are about police and how they managed curfews and responded to protesters, we have a long-standing struggle in our community with police not being able to respond to calls for service. And so that we have to navigate these two issues. We have to navigate both things. Using police appropriately and finding and investing in other services that we need.
But I'm just going to be very clear here. There's a complaint that police don't show up. The police, the data says, spend a disproportionate amount of time on dealing with homeless people. If you put the money that you did in the payroll tax to homeless people, the police would have time to respond to non-homeless things. The city has created this situation by not dealing with the root of the cause, but the symptoms.
Presumably, yes, right. That's what we need to look at. Absolutely, presumably. I don't know whether that simplistic. I don't know how the equation is going to balance out, but I agree with you. Would we be able to shift police resources into homeless services? What does that actually look like in terms of how many dollars get shifted and are available? Is that enough on either side, or do we need a different revenue stream, or do we need to reconfigure the Community Safety Initiative? Yes, absolutely. Those are the questions.
Okay, so I know that a big issue that a lot of people have with how the city operates is like, let's put a task force on it, let's put another committee on it, and let's let the passions of the people die in bureaucracy. You guys have done so many consultations and studies about the homeless here and everything, and you have the information to make the right decisions. the idea that you guys need more of this, I think, is maddening to people. And we wonder where the actual leadership is on this.
So, you know, I guess I wouldn't frame that as you have framed it. So the first thing is we have done our homework, and we do have a strategic plan, and the council has made specific allocations for aspects of our work with the homeless. And we've done that in concert with the county. So we're on that plan. The question now before us is we have this, I think because of COVID, we have lost capacity in our homeless system. So we actually have to recalibrate that, and we have to find other revenue streams or reallocate the money, because we now have less capacity to serve the homeless than we had before. So we're adjusting to a changing landscape. It's not restudy. It's how do we have a plan. We believe in that plan. We've invested in that plan. And we're in the process of implementing that work, but we have this now even greater crisis with homelessness. So, and the plan was, well, I've said enough on that. So yes,
okay. I don't want to get
studying for the sake of studying. And the second thing is, and it comes to my point, which I really want to hear from you, is so we have two city councilors who are proposing a task force related to police procedures, related to related to racial equity. And we're seeing those as needing those task forces, because we actually need to bring people who are not sitting on the city council to the table to talk about that reform. How do we do that effectively? So I recognize that people are, I should say, cynical about the potential for those task forces to make a difference. And so I am very interested in hearing from you, what would effective engagement with the city in changing policies look like to you? How should that work? Is a task force the right thing? Is a series of listening sessions? Is a series of town halls? What would that look like for you to be able to talk to us, to get the response you need, to feel engaged in shaping those solutions?
Well, I think you need to have first of all, I gotta say I'm very disturbed that you haven't reached out to other groups that are making these demands. And I think that
that's all coming. I've told you that.
But Mayor, it should have been you should be talking to them before you're talking to me. I mean, these groups are very organized and have very specific demands, and they are the people who are being targeted and suffer the systematic violence of these kind of organizations. So I think that one thing I'm going to ask you to do is turn on an urgency flip in your switch in your mind and realize that the house is on fire. And so tell people, please let me finish. When you tell people we've got task force and we got this and that, and like we want to listen to you, you need to understand that this is life or death for people. I've got people in this community that I work with, people of color, who, for example, working on the mural with, we had people come yell racial slurs and drive through our mural also while we were there. This is urgent. This is not a pet project. This is a civil rights issue. So that's the fact that I'm very disappointed to hear that you haven't reached out to these people directly. So please, just what would be I have said from the beginning of this conversation, I will reach out, and that I am needing to do that in a kind of disciplined and thorough way. So anybody if you want to send me contacts after this of people you think I should talk to. I mean, I think I have my list, but I want to hear from you who I should talk to and how. And I would be also still very interested in hearing from you what an effective communication process is going to be. What does that look like? What is that engagement in local problem solving look like? Okay, so
work effectively. Would you like to see the city do that work?
this is me, and this is something I would suggest, but like I said, I'm just a white woman who is trying to help with this. So I definitely think you need to get the advisement of those other groups. But I think that it could look something like a live stream summit where you speak to leaders in public on each of these issues, and the council is there and the chief of police is there, and they have to respond to questions directed to them in a public forum. It can't just be talking at a row of blank faces. There needs to be accountability. And this is not rocket science, it's accountability. So I would suggest inviting leaders from each of those groups to the table and setting, as much time as you do for those public hearings, if not more, and let them tell you what they need. And it should be public, and there should be time for them to pose questions to the chief of police. There should be time for them to pose questions to the city manager, to counselors, and you all have to be required to respond. I think that would be a first step of building trust and transparency. Secondly, I think that there is kind of a repulsion at the city councilors and your own tendency to just praise the police as a default. You got to understand the optics of that to people who have not been treated well by the police, the people in our streets telling you that, and the EPD is not perfect, and they have done a lot of things that have hurt this community as well. And to unilaterally praise them is so unnecessary. The fact is, we all need to be better. And so that, I think that's a thing. I think also the city needs to have more, these representatives need to be with these people asking for change. And I want to know why they're not, because this is a civil rights issue. I mean, would you have marched for civil rights back in, MLK's day?
I did.
So where are you now?
I was in high school. Yeah, of course I did.
This is our civil rights movement, and anyone who says it is political is being manipulative. They have a vested interest in it staying the same. So I think there's gotta, if you truly support Black Lives Matter and BIPOC people, you can't be tacit about that. I mean, you are a leader, and you either support this or you don't at this point. We've come to such a boiling point in this country that if you are not in this movement and support the rights of these people, then you, like I said in my email, it is an tacit or otherwise, it's an enforcement of the status quo. And I know that you only have so much power as the mayor, but for example, why in the hell did Betty Taylor and Mike Clark not sign that? And why aren't you guys talking about that publicly?
Councilors are elected by their wards. They represent their wards. This is an elective government. People elect the representatives they want. If you don't want those people in council, don't vote for them. Campaign for their opposition. I mean, that's how it works. So,
have you spoken out against, though? Why they wouldn't sign on to a civil rights statement?
Their actions speak for themselves. They stand up for their actions. You
are a leader, and you have the ability to use to shine light on those things.
It speaks for itself. It speaks for itself. They sign, and they can speak for themselves about why. Elected officials, they can speak for themselves. I don't speak for them.
I understand that, but this is kind of a situation it's a civil rights issue. So, you know, I just feel like if you are in support of this, you would be drawing attention to people who are trying not to support it.
My goal as mayor is to move the council forward to do the work they need to do. That's my goal. And to bring as many councilors along in support of work that's important as possible. That is my goal. So, and that's how I function. I bring it to the table. I manage that agenda. I try to make sure that they have the information they need. At the end of the day, councilors are elected officials accountable to their constituents, and they do what they will do. But my job is to create a landscape in which they have the information they need. We've acted as quickly as we can, and then hope that it goes the way I think it should go. It doesn't always go the way I think it should go. They haven't always done what I would have preferred to see them do on any number of issues. So it is what it is. That's elected government. And it's a time to elect other people. I actually just do want to ask you a question because we just have a few more minutes. And so I am totally on board with your idea of this live stream summit. I'm very interested in it. I've been thinking about that myself. And the question I have for you is, I had been thinking about it, that certainly counselors would be there. But I had also been thinking that perhaps including county commissioners, some county commissioners, and some of our state legislators, because we're functioning at multiple levels here on racial justice and on police reform. So would you see this as best to be, exclusively a city council thing, or do you think that idea of having multiple layers of government might be helpful so that if people have questions about things that are, really fall to the county or the state? I mean, Senator Manning has, been incredibly important at this point. Would that be helpful to have multiple levels of government represented? What do you think?
I mean, in my opinion, I'd have to think about it longer, but I think my hot take on that is have more than one.
Yes, for sure.
If you have one and everybody under the sun that has their finger on the law is there, then I don't think there's going to be time for meaningful discussion.
Yeah.
And I think that there could be a scenario where it's just city, and then the next point it's you bring in more people the next time, or like a different focus group the next time. But I think the first one should be you, city councilors, the chief of police, and the city manager. So that would be my take on that.
All right. I do agree with you. I think it would take more than one. I think partly, everybody can't always come at the single designated time. So if you have more than one, then a broad array of people get to show up, right? Not just as panelists, but speakers. So,
and I think being dedicated to a series of these would also show that it's not a one and done situation
right.
for you, but
right.
an ongoing conversation where you're checking in with these leaders.
Yep.
I know.
I think it's a good idea. I like it.
I want to know, back to the police situation. There was a guy who vandalized our mural, and
right.
now a man who was struck by somebody.
Right.
And what is the EPD doing?
Well, they're doing their investigations. I mean, they have multiple layers, especially in the where Isaiah Wagner was struck by a car. There are multiple layers of different task forces that gather the evidence for that. So that's what they're doing. That takes a little time. And, the goal is to gather enough evidence that when they turn that over to the DA, she has enough evidence that she can file charges if that's appropriate. So if you cut that process short and you don't submit full information, then your chances of having the DA file charges are reduced. So they're aiming to be as thorough as possible.
I know that people are really upset that the driver was released.
I know that.
So what's the explanation behind that?
I don't have anything different to share than you have heard publicly. I mean, the police released him because he had, they said, been a cooperative witness. There was no there was no.
Hit somebody with a car with kids.
I know. I don't have any other insight beyond your sense of outrage about this. I can't answer it. That is what they have said. That is what I understand.
I think you should publicly challenge that if you believe that it was wrong. And I personally find it very, very scary to know that there's somebody willing to drive through a crowd with children present that is free to continue doing that.
Right. Well, right. I mean, the premise is that he intentionally did that. That his intention was to hurt Isaiah. I can't ascribe it. We need the evidence to know whether that. I can't ascribe intention at this point.
So what kind of evidence do you need? Because I think people would argue that there was hundreds of people there that saw it.
Right. And the police are aiming to talk to as many of those people as possible and are hoping to have some video evidence. Right. That's exactly the information we want.
So, I mean, my hope for you would be to put pressure on that. And I think it doesn't make sense to any of us why this driver just was released initially, right, and why it was up to the protesters to make sure he was held accountable at all. I think that I did talk to the police chief yesterday, so I mean it's in process. I'm not part of that process, so I think we do need to let the police gather their information and turn that over to the DA. And if you were disturbed by them not holding him, I think it's your responsibility to say that.
Yeah, I don't understand why they don't hold him, and they have their their protocols of when they hold someone, when they don't.
And have you asked the police chief why they didn't hold him?
I got the same answer that there was a complaint. I didn't explore more deeply. Let's say that. The answer is that he was. I'm most concerned that the investigation proceed. And
don't you think that maybe
information
putting pressure on the investigation would make sure it succeeded in a more equitable sense?
There's no question that there's pressure on this investigation. Well,
do with this what you want, but I think people would really appreciate you coming out and saying the things that you've just said to me publicly. I think that there is a sense that you have a hesitancy to lead when it's not popular. And we've seen it borne out in some ways. And if you want to start gaining the trust of this public and the protesters, I think you need to start being more candid and less worried about political speak. People are really tired of platitudes. And I guarantee that if you approach this group with platitudes and you don't do it with specifics, the protests are going to go on twice as long. This is a very smart, well-educated group of people in all these groups. Granted, I don't know of them, but I've been pretty involved, and they're educated. They understand the policy. They understand how the city works. And I think that you got to do your homework. If you not staying silent is taking the side of the status quo. And so I really wish you would be more candid with your support of this and what is acceptable in our city. We didn't even get to talk about the guy who defaced our mural. And I mean, what's happening with that? I think it's a pretty open and shut case. He was caught on camera.
I don't know what the status of that investigation is.
Well, I think it would be helpful if you looked into it. And maybe let people know you're looking into it. We haven't heard anything. And, to me, when I heard that this man had run into Isaiah, I think the lack of response to the vandalism of the mural emboldens people like this to take the next step because they didn't see the man who defaced the mural held accountable in any way.
Fair enough. I understand that.
And in fact, when the police spoke to me about it, they seemed highly concerned with the fact that he was nervous about his own safety. And that was brought up to me more than the safety of our group members and any accountability about it. So by staying silent on these issues, it emboldens people. And I hope you know that staying silent or trying to walk the middle, it's the time for that is past. And it's going to take courage, and we can't have cowards in government. If you don't think it's right, you need to say it. I don't care how many rich white constituents you have. And I don't want that to sound offensive, but I've been in the city for a long time, and there's a word that a lot of us use, and it's progressive. It's an appearance of being progressive without having on the surface, but without actually doing any of the real work. And I personally find that more detrimental than any alt-right, efforts, or because it gives people the appearance that something's being done when there's not. And
Fair enough. I hear that. Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. And I'm on board with this idea of the live stream, so I will work on that, see where that goes. Thank you very much for that. And you and I can keep in touch, and I will follow up with other leaders of the movement because I am anxious to talk to them. So I appreciate that push as well.
Thank you, Mayor. Would you mind? There'll probably be a link to this recording.
Yeah, I'll see if I'll see if I can figure that one out. Thank you so much. Okay. Hi. Yeah.
If you could make a commitment to me that you will look into both of those police cases.
I will definitely ask. Yep, I'll definitely ask.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.